Exactly 3 years to the day, Russia has been at war with Ukraine, and today we'll take a look at the military situation in the country. I'm Julian Rupke, and this is BILD Situation Room. And we start, of course, with the big picture of Ukraine. We want to look at the situation across the entire country, what Russia has achieved in 3 years, and above all, what they haven't managed to achieve. And we see the map of Ukraine, we notice the red-colored regions. These are the regions, the brightly red-tinted ones, that Russia has taken control of in Ukraine since February of 2022. We can also observe the blue regions, areas which Ukraine has successfully managed to recapture throughout the ongoing span of the last 3 years. And the crucial thing, I believe, is that we can hardly see any difference compared to the situation a year ago. We have observed a few small advances made by the Russian army in the area surrounding Pokrovsk, as well as slightly further south at both Vylyukinovo-Silka and Kurachove. However, around this time last year, Russia had occupied 19%, to be exact, 19.5% of Ukraine. And now it's 20%. That means 0.5% of Ukrainian territory has fallen to Russia in the past 12 months. Because that is still terrible. It's still displaced many thousands of people within Ukraine, even tens of thousands. But if we look at how Russia advanced at the beginning, as well as the dynamic movements in the first few months when Ukraine successfully recaptured the north, multiple parts of the east and several parts of the south, then the overall situation had relatively backed down and did not really shift in favor of Russia. Yet it has indeed proven to be a painstakingly slow and exceedingly costly advance for Putin as the conflict enters its 3rd year. And the question is, of course, how it will play out now without US support, but with increasingly stronger support from the rest of the still Putin-opposing West, namely Australia, Canada and the European Union, how this war will continue into the 4th year of the conflict. We're moving from the big picture to the specifics, looking at the situation of the last few days, and we'll first take a look at Kursk, a Russian region, which we hadn't talked about a year ago, as Ukraine specifically targeted it in August last year. This effort aimed to shift the conflict onto Russian soil to balance the ongoing destruction and devastation, all the defensive efforts that Ukraine was forced to conduct purely within the confines of its own territory. We've received a new video from Kursk demonstrating to us that the Russians are steadily drawing nearer to Sucha. They are now getting closer to this last area that remains under Ukrainian control. Here we can observe a Ukrainian drone, a rather heavy drone, probably equipped with a bomb suspended underneath it, which has the capability of being released or dropped from above. And we see how the Russians have managed, now being very close to Suchan, this former town of 6,000 residents under Ukrainian control, that they can observe relatively precisely. Here we see it, how the Ukrainian drone pilots, here we see one of them who is just coming out, collecting this drone now, how these drone pilots approach their operations, the locations they are stationed at, and the former Russian or current houses where they have found shelter. And now we see how the Russian drone directly comes up close and basically chases the Ukrainian as he's closing the door after he just brought the drone back inside. And we can now clearly see the impact, if you will, of the Russian kamikaze drone here inside the house located in Sucha. And this all shows us that the Russians are getting closer and closer to Sucha from all directions. This means that the area, which was formerly 1,200 square kilometers that was controlled by Ukraine, has shrunk to 400 kilometers. But we're also talking about 6 months. 6 months that Ukraine has managed to occupy a part of Russia and continues to defend it. The city of Sucha, which continues to remain entirely under complete Ukrainian control. Nonetheless, we take a look at the map to understand why Russia is increasingly able to monitor in real time where the Ukrainians are moving and to get closer. Namely, the area is slowly contracting, and we also have confirmation from last week, with first reports indicating that the small town of Sverdlikovo is completely back under Russian control, and that Sucha, we can observe this here, let me sketch it out, approximately here, which is the size of Sucha, showing that it's merely 2, 3, or 4 kilometers in various directions, except towards the north, obviously, and to the south, but in the directions towards the east and the west, there are approximately 4 to 5 kilometers remaining for the Russian drones to travel in order to be right there. And that's why we've just observed that the Russians manage with their fiber optic guided drones in an almost real-time manner. To start while the surveillance drones still see the Ukrainians collecting their own drones there, and then to attack the respective houses. That means the whole thing becomes extremely difficult for the Ukrainians to defend. Nonetheless, this stand we have right here, except for small differences. In the last few days, also here south of Zhuravlivka, we have seen attempts of the Russian advance and also a small Ukrainian counteroffensive. We observe that the area continues to appear relatively constant, much like it did even a month ago. This indicates that the Russians still haven't succeeded in forcing the Ukrainians out of Kursk. From Kursk, we head to Donetsk, wanting to see the major battlefields there. And we must check out the city of Pokrovsk, once 65,000 residents. The clearly stated primary objective of the Russian army here in Donetsk. It's understood that 3 major cities in the Donetsk region remain under Ukrainian control. Of course, that's Slavyansk and Kramatorsk, and notably Pokrovsk. This time, we'll perhaps start by examining the map to better understand how the Ukrainians continue their defense here, because there are new small blue areas forming around Pokrovsk. This indicates that we not only have the situation where the Russians are unable to move forward significantly towards this major city up here, but we even see, based on the situation in Peshane, which we already explained, based on the situation in Kotluna, but also here in Lysivka, which is not marked here, right next to Dakhenska, that the Ukrainian army has managed to recapture small areas around Pokrovsk in recent weeks, and that the Russians are absolutely not making any progress here. And why they're stuck, which we've often discussed, I approach the Ukrainians. Have, from both directions if you will, with one side being the west and the other the north, the opportunity to almost entirely intercept the Russian supply lines heading towards the front in this particular area. First, we'll look at images that show us how the Ukrainian army is targeting the logistics here, and these are images that the Russians certainly cannot like. Almost all vehicles that the Russian army moves towards the front, naturally always with goods on board, like ammo, food, new soldiers, nearly all vehicles are being taken away. Intercepted from the Ukrainian drone fleet, which we've just seen, always attacking from the north and west here. Consequently, Russia is at this moment struggling significantly to deliver any more supplies to the front lines. In other areas, it's different, and sometimes fewer Ukrainian units are stationed there. But in Pokrovsk, it is extremely important for Ukraine to defend the city. And for this reason, they consistently manage to deploy their best drone units alongside Kursk, specifically in this area, so they can conduct operations effectively from here. And so to effectively intercept the majority of the Russian army here. Furthermore, we've observed that virtually no tanks have been seen anywhere near Pokrovsk in the past few days. And it's quite clear why this is happening. When anyone somehow manages to arrive at the front, they are quickly and decisively attacked by Ukrainian Special Forces units. Here we witness a situation, a relatively new development, also in the vicinity of Pokrovsk, where a single T-80 BVM, an updated and modernized T-80 tank originally from the 80s, has successfully managed approach the front. However, for reasons we don't know, this tank was abandoned. Either there was a technical problem, we don't see anything from a previous attack now. Nonetheless, the tank is there and the crew has run away. And what we see here on the far left is a Ukrainian kamikaze drone approaching the tank and now able to get closer. Although we see all these different jammers here, so jamming devices set up everywhere. They appear to be inactive currently, which allows the Ukrainian drone to approach without any hindrance. And now we're seeing the drones approach first. You can see how it's coming from behind, and normally, as we have seen in the past, it would attack from behind. Namely, identified what is often a relative weak point of the tank here. However, in this particular case, it's different. The Ukrainians had been observing the whole thing beforehand and saw that the Russians made a fatal mistake. Namely, they left the hatch open. One of the hatches of this tank was left open. And in this particular scenario, the only even more vulnerable point of the tank isn't located behind the turret, but rather it involves directly flying into the tank with the explosive crown, so to speak, and subsequently trigger the explosion within, thereby bypassing the armor that could otherwise prevent them. Here we now see the drone's approach, quite interestingly marked here again, so yes, I'll still repeat it, that the cap of a person in this tank crew left behind after the soldier made a quick escape, and beside it is an open hatch. The Ukrainians are now making very effective and perfect tactical use of this opportunity to hit this tank precisely at the right spot, so we see it. The impact, and consequently, as the armor fails to provide protection, the entire scenario culminates in a catastrophic explosion of this Russian tank in the vicinity of Pokrovsk. And for the Russians, it's symptomatic of the situation at Pokrovsk. They simply can't manage to attack the city with mechanized infantry anymore. It's become impossible to advance nearby, and for 2 months now, as we've mentioned, instead of moving forward, one has had to retreat further away from Pokrovsk, the former city of 65,000 inhabitants. The situation appears significantly worse for Ukraine in the vicinity of Andriivka, which is several kilometers further to the south. We're going to examine the situation there as well, and also take a closer look at how the Russians managed to successfully gain control of another location, which is Ulagli. We recall Andriivka, a newly established defensive position for the Ukrainian army located a bit to the west of Kurakove. Kurakov, a city with roughly 18,000 residents, endured 6 months of particularly intense fighting, ultimately concluding with a Russian victory. And now we are witnessing here how Ulagli was taken over by the Russian army after intense and heavy fighting. Last week, we examined how over 10 Russian tanks and armored personnel carriers were effectively destroyed in this area before they even managed to reach the starting point. Nevertheless, now the Russian army is in Ulagli, having managed to drive out the Ukrainians, and we also know of at least 5 Ukrainian soldiers who were captured as they held out until the very last moment and made efforts to defend this village. If you have any further questions or need assistance, feel free to ask. We also have a look at the images which illustrate that Ulagli is quite a relatively small place. We also see these streets. I think there are 3 next to each other, 1, 2, 3. These are the 3 streets of Ulagli which stretch approximately a full kilometer from east to west. The Russian army has, as mentioned, managed to establish a foothold here and bring this place completely under its control. We also want to look at that on the map. As I said, it's just a small village. We just saw it. It used to be 3 streets, but for the Russians, that's apparently enough to celebrate, to show that, yes, with the deployment of several hundred soldiers, we lost and dozens of tanks and infantry fighting vehicles, we managed to capture another location again. Here it's quite visible, and our map provider Deep State Map now shows the largest area here in dark red, indicating it has been captured by the Russians. Nevertheless, we still currently can observe these few orange areas as well. The intense battle for Constantinople continues to rage on, with this village being another obstacle that the Russians have to overcome to progress further. And the problem is we can see that too, there aren't many settlements after that, which come here in Donetsk before approaching the Zaporizhzhia region. And of course, the Ukrainians strongly want to prevent Zaporizhzhia from now being directly attacked by the Russian forces coming from the east. And this pattern of attacks on Korakov, which is now no longer displayed here, as well as on Andreevka, repeats itself slightly further to the west, specifically to the north of Vylyukinovo-Silka. Vylyukinovo-Silka, a town that once had 5,600 residents, was captured by the Russian military forces. And here the Russians are trying to advance, trying to push forward with tanks and infantry fighting vehicles, and we see the situation here is much more complicated for the Ukrainian army because they simply lack as many military units stationed here. This is primarily the 110th Brigade of the Ukrainian army trying to hold the front relatively on their own here. In Pokrovsk, based on the information I have, there are more than 10 distinct Ukrainian units from a variety of brigades that are collaborating together in their efforts to defend this area. This overall situation isn't considered very critical or crucial for Ukraine. As a result, they are essentially or of course allowing the Russians to make advances. But that's why you don't deploy so many resources to defend these small villages. And here we see another attack at Novi Koma, where the 110th Brigade manages to counter a major offensive by the Russian army. We can see at least 6 tanks involved here, or armored personnel carriers, managed to successfully intercept this attack. This means dealing with all of the vehicles that the Russians are deploying once again from Novo Koma, just north of Vylyukinovo-Silka, to advance and destroy those tanks entirely. However, we will soon be able to see, ultimately, the Russians were again able to meet their key objective. Although they lost all their equipment and mobility, still they nevertheless managed to succeed. To fit into another village on foot, here we observe another tank, and we can see once again just how fully loaded these vehicles actually are. Now, so after the first drone probably has already hit its target, here comes the second drone strike. And now we can clearly see the Russian soldiers hurriedly running in all directions, trying to find safety and cover from the potentially exploding ammunition of this tank right here, ensuring they are out of harm's way. We can clearly see, yes, many Russian soldiers are actively moving about, and that was Novo Koma already successfully seized by the Russian army just a few weeks back. And now we are witnessing once again that the infantry fighting vehicles, as well as the tanks, which had deployed the infantry further to the north, are currently trying to pull back. They attempt to head back south towards Vylyukinovo-Silka, but once again they are stopped in their tracks, because they are not only at risk from Ukrainian drones when approaching and landing troops, but we also see that the Ukrainians are using drones, as we can see here, as well as artillery, and just bombard Novo Koma and the surrounding Russian troops so heavily that they still face a major problem even during their retreat. Once more, we observe that Russia is losing nearly all of its deployed tanks and armored vehicles during their attempted advance. Nevertheless, as the forthcoming video demonstrates, they have once again succeeded in gaining a foothold in yet another village. Specifically, as we are about to notice on the upcoming map, there is the small village of Novutsere-Tuwate, which is located to the north of Novo Koma. Complicated name, and in Novutsere-Tuwate we also see Russian soldiers raising their flag, once again showing, we made it, we got there. What they obviously don't show us, and what we just saw in the Ukrainian video, is that they once again lost all 6 tanks and infantry fighting vehicles used in the process, likely also lost a large part of its infantry, and that's precisely the Ukrainian strategy, to wear down the opponent as much as possible to inflict as large losses as possible. Hoping, and this is proving true at least in the east of the country, that one can advance more slowly from the Russian side, simply because there are neither enough soldiers nor enough tanks for further advancement. We'll also take a look at the map. examined the situation near Velika Novosilka and realized that even here, this formerly haphazard front, as we recall, where the Russians had attempted to advance from various directions, had then taken control of part of Velika Novosilka. However, this area has since been straightened out by the Russian military forces. So they have successfully managed once again to establish a relatively evenly set up or formed front here in the end. And what we just saw was, on one hand, the Russian attack, as mentioned, from Novokoma heading north. And secondly, we saw the Russians here in Novoyeretovate, who had once again established a foothold. That means, yes, it's sort of like a déjà vu from various other places we've encountered before. The Russians are attempting to advance, deploying a lot of technology, but are getting heavily decimated. But those who make it, who survive, have very, very few Ukrainian defenders on the ground. We saw that earlier in Ulakli, where there were 5 Ukrainian soldiers holding the front, at least the ones who were captured, and maybe there were another 20 or 30 involved. In any case, this numerical advantage on the ground is still there. The Ukrainians have very competent drone units and artillery units, but their problem is the infantry, and their problem is being able to even remotely match the Russians in terms of manpower on the ground, such as the Russian army is managing to do to continue advancing here. That really is the core problem. We're looking to the northeast of the country in Sumy. There, the Russian army has achieved a significant strike, in my opinion. In other words, another Ukrainian S-300 air defense system has been taken out. And indeed, it was discovered in this location. It's probably difficult for the layperson to see at first glance, but if you examine it closely, it's this snowy road where the different vehicles have strategically positioned themselves. You can also see here that they drove through the forest, and since it's winter now, there's much less cover from the trees, specifically for these vehicles. And here we observe it once again in detail. The Russian surveillance drone successfully detected these vehicles at approximately 30 kilometers away from the Russian-Ukrainian border, identified the various components of the S-300 system in this area, and what we're about to witness is another missile strike, specifically a ballistic attack carried out with an Iskander missile. We're about to witness it shortly, happening on this vehicle, and we can clearly tell from these very typical explosions that rocket fuel is also causing the explosions here. This means that in this case, it is probably, most likely not a dummy of an S-300 system, but rather actually one of the systems that Ukraine has deployed to protect and provide defense for the entire area, encompassing both Sumy as well as the adjacent Kursk region, against Russian military aircraft incursions. Once again, this unfortunately ends up favoring the Russians, who have managed in recent years to take over a large part of the former Soviet regions, to destroy Ukraine's system. Luckily, Ukraine got supplies mainly from Germany, including Patriot and Iris-T. That means that despite such losses, which are always very painful for the Ukrainian army, one can still defend oneself, at least to a certain extent, against Russian attacks. Now we come to the final point about this defense against Russian attacks, specifically against Russian kamikaze drone attacks. We're examining new footage from Odessa, a city located in the southwestern part of Ukraine, and we're observing these severe and massive attacks being launched every single night from Crimea and southern Russia, which also fly over Odessa. We notice that it's always the same drones being used, namely Geran 2 drones, which are about 4 meters long, and these are being destroyed by Ukraine every night. And there are up to 200, sometimes even 230 drones in total, with which Russia attacks in one night. That means they are consistently attempting to overcome the Ukrainian air defense systems here. However, we have also seen that Ukraine has a variety of means, whether it's their own drones that they use against it, helicopters, anti-aircraft missiles, or also directly, we are witnessing the use of anti-aircraft guns to effectively destroy these Geran 2 drones. Now we're going to watch one last video, which I also find very impressive. Here's another Geran 2 coming in closer, and we're viewing it from the perspective of a gunner operating an M2 Browning, which is a heavy machine gun being deployed here by a mobile team. And now we are able to see how the shooter fires at the Geran 2, hitting it right away, which results in it crashing. From a few meters up, I should say, they fly up to about 200 meters. And then this significant massive explosion on the ground effectively managed to protect a critical piece of Ukrainian infrastructure once more. So, what are we observing? Russia is still trying to destroy Ukraine, attempting it with a multitude of hundreds of drones. Every day there are ballistic missiles and other types that continue to arrive. Ukraine employs high-tech means and receives strong support from the West, particularly as the US steps back from its role in Europe and from what was once the unified Western alliance, to push back the Russians. And in the 4th year of the war, there's still little indication that the Russians will make a large breakthrough, but also little evidence that Ukraine can reclaim its land from Russian occupiers again.